I sold the house. The one my brother thought was his forever home, the one I paid for, was gone before his wedding night even ended. How did it come to that? And why would someone do something so extreme to their own family? My name is Emily Carter. I run a small consulting business, helping local companies grow. And this is the story of how I learned slowly, painfully, that sometimes the people who call you family are the ones who feel most entitled to erase you. This isn't a story about greed or revenge the way people like to imagine it. It's a story about boundaries, about being invisible for years, and about the exact moment I stopped begging to belong. I still remember the look on my brother Jason's face when he realized the key didn't work. He rattled the door like force alone could undo what had already happened, shouting my name into the dark. I stood a few steps back on the porch, quiet, steady, holding something I had never held before control. But that moment didn't come out of nowhere. It was set in motion years earlier, in a kitchen that smelled like old coffee and warm milk, when I was 12 years old and learned what my place in the family really was. If you're listening to this right now, let me ask you something. Where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments. Because if you've ever been the one who tried harder, gave more, stayed quieter, and still ended up last, you're going to understand this story in a way that's hard to explain. It started on a humid Saturday morning in our Tennessee kitchen, the kind of morning where the air already felt heavy before noon, and the screen door complained every time it opened. I was 12, small enough that my feet didn't quite touch the floor when I sat at the table, but old enough to feel the sting of being overlooked. Jason, my older brother, was already there, 14, confident, leaning back in his chair like the world had already agreed to meet him halfway. He shoveled cereal into his mouth with one hand and scrolled through his flip phone with the other. My mom poured him orange juice while my dad reached into his wallet. "Here," Dad said, sliding a crisp 20 across the table. "That should cover lunch next week. You've got practice, right?" Jason nodded without looking up. "Coach says we might travel to Memphis." "Good," Dad replied, folding his wallet shut. I stepped into the room then, holding my empty lunch bag like an apology. I think I need lunch money too. Mine ran out on Thursday." My mom didn't even turn around. "Emily, we've talked about this. You're old enough to manage what you're given. Be smarter next time." I opened my mouth again, but Jason snorted under his breath. Dad cut in before I could finish. "Jason's a boy," he said casually. "Boys eat more. Boys need more." I stared at him, waiting for the joke. None came. "Are you serious?" I asked. Dad stood up, straightening his belt like the conversation bored him. "Don't get dramatic. You'll survive. If you want money, babysit. Earn it." Jason smirked at me over his spoon. The glass of milk in my hand trembled. It was just a plain tumbler, nothing special, but my face burned like I'd been caught doing something wrong. I set it down harder than I meant to, not enough to break it, just enough to make everyone look. "So he gets everything because he's a boy?" My voice cracked, but I didn't stop. My mom finally turned around, towel in her hands, tired irritation on her face. "Stop making this a thing. Boys just have different needs. That's biology, honey." Jason leaned back and grinned. "Relax, Em. Girls are better at sharing, right?" The silence that followed wasn't calm. It was thick, pressing against my chest like a weight. I bit my lip until I tasted blood, not because I was scared, but because I knew if I spoke again, I'd cry. And crying never changed anything in our house. It just made me look weak. I grabbed my lunch bag and walked out, catching Jason winking at me like this was all some joke I didn't understand. But I understood perfectly. That morning was the first time I realized I would always be second to a boy who never had to prove himself. Second to parents who called unfairness logic. Second in a house where I had done nothing wrong except be born a girl. As I passed the laundry room, the door hanging crooked on its hinge, I made a promise I didn't say out loud. I'll never ask them for $1 again. I didn't know how yet, but I knew I would find my own way. One day, they'd have to look at me not as the girl who needed too much, but as the woman they never saw coming. That glass of milk taught me more about justice than any class ever did. And they had no idea what they'd just set in motion. Years later, when I stood on that porch watching Jason struggle with a lock he assumed was his, I thought back to that kitchen, to the way my needs had been dismissed so easily, to how often I'd been told to be quieter, smaller, more understanding. People ask me now if selling the house was cruel. They don't ask how it felt to be invisible for most of my life. They don't ask what it cost to keep showing up for people who only see your value when it benefits them. But that's getting ahead of the story. This is how it began. With a glass of milk, a wrinkled $20 bill, and the first time I understood that fairness in my family had conditions. And once you see that clearly, you can never unsee it. After that morning in the kitchen, something in me shifted. Not loudly, not in a way anyone else could see. It was quieter than that, heavier, like a door closing somewhere deep inside my chest. I didn't slam it shut, I just stopped knocking. I kept my promise. I never asked them for money again. At first, it was small things. I stopped mentioning field trips that cost extra. I stopped asking for new shoes when mine wore thin at the heels. I learned how to stretch what I had, how to pretend I wasn't hungry when my lunch ran out early, how to smile and say, "I'm fine," until the words felt automatic. There's a special kind of loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people and still feeling like you're asking for too much just by existing. I learned that feeling early. Jason didn't notice the change in me. Why would he? Nothing in his world had changed. He still had rides to practice, cash slid across the table, praise for things he hadn't earned yet. My parents didn't notice either, or maybe they did, and silence was easier than correction. Either way, I became very good at disappearing in plain sight. By the time I turned 15, I was already looking for ways out, not running away, exactly, just preparing. I watched how adults talked about money, about work, about what counted as real effort. I listened more than I spoke. I learned which teachers would quietly slip you an extra worksheet, and which ones looked the other way when you stayed late in the library because you didn't want to go home yet. I got my first job the summer I was supposed to be too young, a diner just off Route 9, the kind of place where the floors always felt slightly sticky and the coffee tasted burnt no matter how fresh the pot was. I lied about my age on the application, wrote 16 instead of 15. My handwriting shook, but the manager barely glanced at it. He needed someone to cover late shifts, someone who would show up and not complain. That someone was me. The work wasn't glamorous. I wiped down counters, refilled napkin holders, learned how to smile through comments that made my skin crawl. But every paycheck felt like proof. Proof that I didn't need permission to survive. Proof that my worth wasn't theoretical. It came in envelopes, in hours logged, in blisters on my feet that no one at home ever asked about. I hid the money in a shoebox under my bed, folded tight, organized by date. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I didn't tell my parents about the job. They thought I stayed late for debate club or study group, something respectable, something that didn't challenge the idea that I was still dependent. For a while, I let myself believe I'd cracked the code, that hard work was enough, that if I kept my head down and my hands busy, I could build a future quietly, without asking anyone for help. Then one Tuesday night, that illusion cracked. The manager called me into the back office. He wouldn't meet my eyes. There had been an inspection. Questions about payroll, ages, rules I didn't even know I was breaking. He was kind about it, as kind as someone can be when they're telling you your lifeline is being cut. He slid my last paycheck across the desk, neat and final. "I'm sorry, Emily," he said, using my real name for the first time. "You're a good worker, but I can't risk the place." I nodded. I thanked him. I didn't cry. I walked home in the dark, the air sharp in my lungs, the envelope burning in my jacket pocket like it was something alive. I remember thinking, for the first time, that maybe my parents were right. Maybe girls like me weren't meant to get ahead. Maybe effort only mattered when someone was willing to see it. But I didn't go home and collapse. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. I sat on my bed, opened the shoebox, and counted every bill. $223.17. Not enough to save me, enough to try again. Losing that job taught me something flipping burgers never could. The world didn't care how hard you worked. It cared how well you adapted. And I was tired of playing by rules that never seemed to apply to people like me anyway. That's when I started selling things online. At first, it was just stuff I already owned. Old boots from middle school, a dress I'd worn once and never felt comfortable in again. I took photos by the window, laid everything out on a wrinkled white sheet, wrote descriptions that were honest but hopeful. Gently worn. Still has life left. I didn't expect much. Then something sold. $10, then another, 20, small amounts, but each notification felt like a quiet victory. No manager, no permission, just me and a system. I was slowly learning how to work. I started paying attention. Which items moved fast? Which ones sat? I learned that presentation mattered. That story sold better than objects. That people loved the idea of giving something a second chance. By the time my acceptance letter from the University of Memphis arrived, I was already thinking differently. I wasn't dreaming about dorm life or football games. I was thinking in numbers, rent, books, food. I held that letter in my hands like it was both a promise and a dare. I'll figure it out, I told myself that night, and for the first time, I believed it. The summer before college was a blur of early mornings and dusty garage sales. I learned which neighborhoods priced things too high and which ones just wanted clutter gone. I learned how to smile sweetly and ask for $1 off without sounding desperate. I scrubbed purses with vinegar, stitched loose seams by hand, lined items up on the kitchen counter like inventory instead of junk. I named my little shop something that made me feel hopeful, something that sounded like growth. The first month, I made just under $300. The second month, double that. It wasn't magic. It was time, attention, and the kind of stubbornness that comes from knowing no one is coming to save you. My parents watched all of this from a distance. My mom called it a phase. My dad barely commented at all. Jason didn't ask. And I stopped waiting for any of them to notice. I moved into a small apartment near campus with 2 roommates who didn't care what time I came home or why I was always packing boxes. I studied during the day and worked at night, living on cheap food and determination. There were nights I fell asleep with shipping labels stuck to my jeans, nights my hands cramped from folding cardboard, nights I wondered how much longer I could keep pushing like this. But every time I thought about quitting, I thought about that kitchen, about the $20 bill slid across the table, about being told I'd survive. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was building something, quietly, piece by piece. And even though no one in my family was paying attention, even though I was still invisible to the people who were supposed to care the most, I could feel it happening. I was becoming someone they wouldn't recognize. Someone who didn't ask. Someone who didn't wait. I didn't know yet how far that path would take me. I didn't know it would end with contracts and keys and a house worth more than anyone in my family ever imagined I could afford. All I knew then was this. I had stopped asking for permission to exist. And once you cross that line, there's no going back. By the time I turned 16, I didn't feel 16 at all. I felt older, worn in at the edges, like I'd already lived several versions of a life and learned which ones were off limits to girls like me. I had my routines, my lists, my quiet rules. Don't ask, don't expect, don't rely. Those rules kept me moving, but they also kept me alone. College was getting closer, and with it a kind of pressure I couldn't name out loud. Not excitement, not fear, something heavier. Everyone around me talked about the future like it was a gift waiting to be opened. I saw it more like a bill coming due. Tuition, books, rent, food. None of those numbers had parents attached to them in my head. They were mine, all mine. I worked harder the summer before junior year than I ever had before. I doubled down on reselling, waking up early to hit garage sales before the good stuff disappeared, staying up late, photographing inventory, and answering messages from buyers in different time zones. My hands were always dry from cardboard and cleaning solution. My phone buzzed constantly with notifications, small sales, small wins, tiny reminders that this thing I was building actually existed. It was exhausting, but it was clean exhaustion. Honest. No one could take credit for it. No one could tell me I hadn't earned it. That fall, I started taking business classes at the community center after school. Nothing official, just free workshops advertised on a corkboard near the library entrance. Marketing basics, budgeting, intro to spreadsheets. I sat in the back, took notes like my life depended on it, and asked questions no one else bothered with. The instructors didn't know my story, but they saw my focus. One of them pulled me aside after class and said, "You think like someone who's had to figure things out the hard way." He meant it as a compliment. I took it like a confirmation. At home, nothing changed. Jason was still Jason. Loud, confident, certain the world would bend eventually because it always had. He talked about college like it was inevitable, like it was something that happened to him, rather than something he had to plan for. My parents listened, nodded, offered advice and reassurance. I stayed quiet. Not because I didn't have dreams, but because I'd learned they sounded smaller when spoken out loud in that house. One night, my mom found me at the kitchen table, surrounded by shipping boxes and a laptop balanced on a stack of old magazines. She frowned like she was trying to solve a puzzle she didn't enjoy. "You're still doing that online thing?" she asked. "Yes," I said, taping a box shut. She shook her head. "I just don't see how this helps you in the long run. You should be focusing on real work, something stable." I looked at her, then back at my screen. A new sale notification popped up. I didn't smile, but something inside me settled. "I am," I said quietly. She sighed and walked away. The conversation dismissed like so many before it. That was fine. I wasn't building this for her approval anymore. I was building it because it was working. The first real shift came the winter. I turned 17. My online shop had grown enough that I needed a separate account just to keep things straight. I opened my first savings account under my own name, my hands shaking slightly as I signed the paperwork. The teller smiled at me like this was normal, like I wasn't rewriting the rules of my own life one form at a time. Seeing that balance, even though it was still modest, changed something fundamental in me. It wasn't about the amount. It was about the fact that I had created it. From nothing. From leftovers and patience and refusal. Around that same time, I got accepted to the University of Memphis. The letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, thin but heavy with meaning. I sat on my bed and read it 3 times, then a 4th just to be sure the words hadn't changed. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I folded it carefully and tucked it into a drawer like something sacred. I didn't tell my parents right away. When I finally did, my mom smiled politely, asked about tuition, then immediately followed it with, "We'll have to see what makes sense financially." Dad nodded, already half distracted. Jason clapped me on the shoulder and said, "Nice. Guess you're smart after all." That was it. No discussion of how I'd pay, no offers, no plans. And strangely, I wasn't surprised. I'd already planned for this version of reality. I'd been planning for it since I was 12. The months leading up to graduation blurred together, school by day, business by night. I ate a lot of rice and lentils. I stopped buying anything that wasn't strictly necessary. I learned how to stretch shampoo bottles with water, how to fix broken zippers, how to say no to invitations without sounding bitter. My friends thought I was intense. Maybe I was. But intensity was cheaper than helplessness. There were moments, late at night, when doubt crept in, when I stared at my laptop screen and wondered if I was being reckless, if I was chasing independence so hard that I'd forgotten what rest felt like. In those moments, my mind always went back to the same place. That kitchen, that $20 bill, that quiet understanding that no one was going to step in for me. So I kept going. By the time I moved into my tiny apartment near campus, I wasn't scared. I was tired, yes. Nervous, sure, but I wasn't scared. I knew how to survive. I'd been doing it for years already. The apartment was nothing special. Thin walls, wobbly furniture, a shared kitchen that always smelled faintly of burnt toast. But it was mine. I paid the deposit. I paid the rent. I carried my boxes up the stairs myself and unpacked slowly, deliberately, like I was marking territory. College was harder than I expected and easier than I feared. Hard because the workload was relentless. Easy because, For once, effort actually translated into results. Professors noticed when I stayed late to ask questions. Group projects went smoother when I took charge. Numbers made sense to me. Systems did too. I wasn't guessing anymore. I was calculating. My business kept growing alongside my classes. I learned how to automate listings, how to manage inventory, how to spot trends before they peaked. It wasn't glamorous, but it was consistent. And consistency, I'd learned, was power. At home, my absence barely registered. I visited less and less, not out of anger, but out of clarity. I didn't fit into the role they'd assigned me anymore, and they didn't know what to do with the version of me who didn't ask for anything. Sometimes, late at night, I wondered if they would ever see me, really see me. Not as the quiet daughter, not as the afterthought, but as someone who had built a life with her own hands. The thought still mattered then. I hadn't fully let it go. I didn't know yet that success would eventually make me visible in a way silence never did. I didn't know that money would change how they spoke to me, how my brother would look at me, how my parents would suddenly remember my name in conversations that mattered. All I knew was that I was no longer waiting, not for approval, not for fairness, not for someone to finally decide I was enough. I was moving forward, one decision at a time, building a future that didn't require permission. And even though I couldn't see the end of the road yet, I could feel the ground beneath my feet growing steadier with every step. By my second year of college, something subtle but important had changed. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was shaping things. Not boldly, not loudly, but deliberately. I could feel it in the way I planned my weeks, the way I thought in margins and projections, instead of wishes. My life had started to move according to systems I understood, and for the first time, that made me feel steady. My reselling business wasn't a side hustle anymore. It had a rhythm. I woke before sunrise on Saturdays, not because I had to, but because that was when garage sales opened and thrift stores were quiet. I learned the language of places like that, the difference between priced to move and priced with emotion. I learned which brands people searched for at midnight and which colors photographed best under. Soft morning light. I learned patience too. Not everything sold quickly, and not everything that looked valuable was. That lesson carried further than I realized at the time. My dorm room slowly transformed into a miniature warehouse. Boxes stacked neatly against one wall. A folding table I'd rescued from the trash became my packing station, shipping labels printed at odd hours. My roommates joked that I ran an underground operation. They weren't wrong. It just happened to be legal and painfully honest. I tracked everything: sales, returns, fees, shipping costs. I kept a spiral notebook at first, then moved to spreadsheets once the numbers got harder to hold in my head. There was comfort in that structure. Numbers didn't care about gender. They didn't play favorites. They told the truth whether you liked it or not. At night, after classes and orders were packed, I'd sit on my bed with my laptop balanced on my knees, running projections for fun. Not because I had to, but because it felt like control. Like proof that I wasn't guessing anymore. I wasn't hoping things would work out. I was making them work. My parents knew I was busy. That was about it. Phone calls were short, functional. My mom asked if I was eating enough. My dad asked about classes. Jason didn't call at all. When I went home for holidays, they treated my work like a phase I'd eventually outgrow. Something cute, temporary, not worth real concern. One night, during winter break, my mom watched me packing orders at the kitchen table and shook her head. "You really think this is going to turn into something?" she asked. Not unkindly, but not curiously either. "I know it already has," I said, sealing a box. She sighed, like I'd missed the point. "I just don't want you wasting time. You need something stable, something with benefits." I almost laughed. Not because she was wrong, but because she had no idea how stable this already was. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I'd learned by then that explanations were a form of permission-seeking, and I was done asking. Instead, I focused on what was growing quietly beneath the surface. By the end of that year, my income from reselling had covered my books, my food, and most of my rent. I wasn't living comfortably, but I wasn't drowning either, and that mattered. more than I admitted out loud. That summer, I took an unpaid internship at a small local marketing firm. It wasn't glamorous, mostly research, analytics, drafting posts no one read. But I absorbed everything. I watched how clients spoke about money, about growth, about fear disguised as strategy. I learned what businesses needed and what they pretended not to need. And slowly, a thought began to take shape. What if I could offer this myself? I'd already done it in a way, for my own shop, for sellers I'd connected with online. I understood consumer behavior because I lived inside it. I understood scarcity because I'd felt it. And I understood growth not as a buzzword, but as something fragile that required attention. The idea scared me, not because it was impossible, but because it made sense. I spent the rest of the summer testing it quietly, helping a friend optimize her online listings, creating a content calendar for a local cafe in exchange for free meals, running numbers for a thrift store owner who wanted to expand online but didn't know where to start. I didn't charge much. Sometimes I didn't charge at all. I just wanted proof. It worked. By the time classes started again, I had my first paying client, then a second, then a referral. I registered a business name, something simple, something that felt like growth instead of noise. I opened a separate account, printed basic invoices, learned how to talk about my work without apologizing for it. That was new. The not apologizing part. I didn't tell my family right away. Not because I was hiding, but because I wanted to see what it looked like before anyone else had an opinion. I wanted something that existed, even if no one clapped. When my mom finally heard about it through a relative, she called me. Her tone was different. Curious, almost careful. "I heard you're doing consulting now." "I am," I said. "That sounds serious." I smiled to myself. It was the first time she'd said anything I did sounded serious. Jason heard around the same time. He texted me one afternoon, casual as ever. "Didn't know you were into business stuff now. That's cool." Cool. The words sat oddly between us. For years, he'd barely noticed me. Now suddenly, I was interesting. Not because I was me, but because what I was doing fit into a category he respected. I tried not to let it get to me. But part of me hoped. Quietly. Stupidly. Maybe this was the turning point. Maybe success would translate into belonging. That hope made me careless. When Jason invited me to dinner with him and his girlfriend, Tessa, I said yes without thinking too hard. When they talked about their future, their plans, their desire to settle down, I listened with an openness I hadn't offered in years. And when they showed me photos of the house, they wanted the wraparound porch, the clean lines, the promise in the sunlight. I felt something soften. They couldn't afford it on their own. Not yet. The down payment was steep, the timing bad. Jason danced around the ask. But I heard it anyway. I knew what they wanted before they said it. That night, alone in my apartment, I opened my laptop and ran the numbers. I could do it. Not easily, but cleanly. It would stretch me, but it wouldn't break me. And for the first time in my life, I was in a position to give without losing myself. Or so I thought. I told myself it wasn't about approval, that I was doing it because I wanted to, because family helped family, because I was strong enough now that it wouldn't cost me anything real. What I didn't realize then was that I was still negotiating for a seat I'd never been offered. I was still hoping money could translate into something it never had before. Respect. Inclusion. A place that didn't feel conditional. I signed the papers carefully, made sure everything was in order. The house was in my name temporarily, on paper until the wedding, until things were finalized. A formality, I told myself. A precaution. Looking back now, I see it for what it was. Instinct. The part of me that had learned years ago in a hot kitchen with a glass of milk in her hand that security had to be built quietly and held close. At the time, though, I didn't think of it that way. I thought I was being generous. I thought I was closing a distance that had existed for too long. I didn't know yet that I was stepping into the most painful lesson of all, that some people don't want you strong unless your strength is useful to them, and even then, they'll take it without making room for you. But that realization was still ahead of me. For now, all I knew was that I had crossed a line, from survival into significance, from invisible into visible. And whether I was ready for it or not, everything was about to change. The moment people in my family realized I was doing well, the atmosphere shifted, not all at once, not in a way you could point to and say, "This is it," but subtly like the air changing before a storm. Voices softened, questions appeared where there had once been silence. My name started showing up in conversations that mattered. At first, it felt strange, almost unreal. For so long, I'd existed on the edge of things present but not consulted, helpful but not considered. Now suddenly, my mother wanted updates. My father asked how business was going. Jason, who used to barely look up when I entered a room, started calling instead of texting. Small gestures, maybe meaningless to someone else, but to me they felt like doors cracking open. I tried not to read too much into it. I told myself it was normal, that families evolve, that people notice growth when it becomes visible. Still, a part of me couldn't help hoping, quietly, carefully. Maybe this was what I'd been working toward without admitting it. Not praise, just acknowledgement. The first time it really hit me was during a Sunday dinner at my parents' house. It had been months since I'd sat at that table, the same table where I'd once been told boys needed more. I brought a fruit tart from a bakery near my apartment, something small but thoughtful. My mom commented on it immediately, asking where I'd bought it, saying it looked nice. That alone felt new. Jason was already there, relaxed, confident as ever. He greeted me with a hug that lingered half a second longer than expected. "You look good," he said, scanning me like he was trying to place something. "Busy these days?" "I am," I said. "Work's been steady." My mom perked up. "I heard you're doing consulting now." The word landed between us like it carried weight. Consulting, serious sounding, adult, worth asking about. I nodded. "Yeah, mostly small businesses. Marketing, analytics, growth strategies." Jason whistled lightly. "That's impressive. Didn't know you had it in you." It wasn't meant to be cruel, but it still stung. I smiled anyway. I'd gotten good at that. "Neither did I," said. Dinner moved on, but something had shifted. My parents asked more questions than they answered. Jason listened instead of talking over me. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like background noise. And as dangerous as it was, I let myself believe it meant something. A few weeks later, Jason called and asked if I wanted to meet him and his girlfriend, Tessa, for coffee. I hesitated. Not because I didn't like Tessa, I barely knew her, but because invitations from Jason usually came with conditions. Still, I said yes. We met at a quiet cafe just outside the city. Tessa waved enthusiastically when she saw me, her smile easy and open. She had the kind of confidence that came from having always been welcome. Jason pulled out a chair for me, ordered drinks, made small talk like we were a normal trio with no history attached. Then he slid his phone across the table. "We wanted to show you something," he said. Photos filled the screen. A house, 2 stories, wraparound porch, sunlight spilling through wide windows. It wasn't flashy, but it was warm, the kind of place people imagined growing into. Tessa leaned forward, eyes bright. We fell in love with it the second we saw it. Jason nodded. "It's perfect. Just, the timing's rough, with the wedding and everything." I didn't say anything at first. I didn't need to. I could hear what he wasn't saying. The down payment, the gap, the expectation. He cleared his throat. "We were wondering if you might be able to help, just to get us started." There it was. I sat back, letting the moment stretch, not out of cruelty, but because I needed to hear my own thoughts. I'd spent years building something quietly, carefully, and now, for the first time, someone in my family was asking, not telling, not assuming asking. That mattered. "I can look at the numbers," I said slowly. That night, alone in my apartment, I did more than look. I ran projections, worst-case scenarios, best-case outcomes. I accounted for taxes, maintenance, everything. I could do it. It wouldn't be easy, but it was possible, and that scared me more than it excited me. Because with that possibility came a question I hadn't faced before. Was I doing this because I wanted to, or because I still wanted something from them? I told myself it was the former, that I was strong enough now that generosity wouldn't cost me my dignity, that helping family was normal, healthy, even, and maybe a part of me still wanted to believe that love, if offered freely enough, could change old patterns. So I agreed. The process moved quickly. Paperwork, signatures, meetings. I paid for the house in full, with the understanding that the title would remain in my name until after the wedding. A technical detail. A safeguard. I told myself it was just practical. Still, something in me insisted on it. Quiet, but firm. Jason was ecstatic. He shook my hand like a business partner, then hugged me like a sister. Tessa's eyes filled with tears. "We'll never forget this," she said. My parents cried when they found out. Real tears. My mom called me sweetheart again. My dad said he was proud. Words I'd waited years to hear. For a moment, I let myself have it. That warmth, that sense of finally being seen. The weeks that followed were filled with planning and excitement, wedding details, guest lists, conversations that included me instead of skirting around me. Jason even asked for my business card once, joking that he might need my help someday. I laughed, but inside, something fragile bloomed. I started coming around more, answering calls, saying yes when my mom invited me over. I told myself I was cautious, but truthfully, I was hopeful, maybe naive, but hopeful. That's what made the text hurt the way it did. It came on a Thursday evening. No warning, no context. "Hey, don't take this personally, but you're not invited to the wedding. It's for close family only." I read it once, then again, waiting for the follow-up, the explanation, anything. Nothing came. My chest tightened, not in a dramatic way, but in that slow, sinking way that told me I already knew the truth. I wasn't misreading it. This wasn't a mistake. This was deliberate. I typed and erased responses until my fingers ached. Finally, I sent a single word. Understood. The message showed as read. No reply followed. I sat there for a long time, staring at the screen, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. The house, the hugs, the pride, the way I'd let myself believe that value could buy belonging. Later, I drove to my parents' house, needing to hear someone say it wasn't real, that Jason was being thoughtless, that of course I was invited. They didn't. My father shrugged. "It's his wedding." My mother sighed. "We don't want drama." That was when it finally clicked. All of it, the attention, the warmth, the sudden interest in my life, none of it was about me. It was about what I could provide. And the moment my presence threatened the image they wanted to present, I was expendable again. I left that night without raising my voice, without tears. Something in me had gone very still. I drove home thinking about the house, about the paperwork, about the fact that, legally, it was still mine. And for the first time since that morning in the kitchen years ago, I didn't feel small. I felt clear. I didn't know yet what I was going to do. But I knew one thing for certain. I was done negotiating for a place at a table that only wanted me when I was useful. And whatever came next, it wouldn't be quiet. The days after that text passed in a strange blur. On the surface, everything looked normal. I answered emails. I met with clients. I paid invoices. I smiled at baristas and thanked cashiers. But underneath all of it, something fundamental had shifted. A final layer of illusion had peeled away, and once it was gone, I couldn't put it back. I replayed Jason's message in my head more times than I'd like to admit. "Don't take this personally." Those 4 words echoed louder than the rest. Because how else was I supposed to take it? I wasn't being uninvited from a casual dinner or a weekend trip. I was being erased from a milestone. From a moment that families mark in photos and speeches and shared history. And it was happening after I'd handed over the largest gift of my life without being asked twice. What hurt most wasn't the exclusion itself. It was the ease of it. The casual certainty that I wouldn't make a fuss. that I'd swallow it the way I always had. I didn't. The following Friday evening, I drove to my parents' house. Not angry, not dramatic, just determined to hear the truth out loud. I needed to see their faces when the words were said, needed to know whether this was ignorance or agreement. My mother answered the door with a smile that flickered when she saw me. "Oh, hi, Emily." She stepped aside, already turning back toward the kitchen. "We're just about to eat." The house smelled the same as it always had. Roasted chicken, green beans. Familiar, comforting, and completely indifferent to what I was carrying inside. My father sat at the table, reading the mail, glasses perched low on his nose. He didn't look up when I walked in. We ate in near silence at first, forks scraping plates, the hum of the refrigerator filling the space where conversation should have been. I waited. I gave them the chance to bring it up themselves. They didn't. So I did. "I got Jason's message," I said, keeping my voice steady. "About the wedding." My dad grunted softly, still focused on the envelope in his hands. My mother paused, then resumed cutting her food. "You're not going to say anything?" I asked. My father set the mail down slowly, like he was choosing his words carefully. "It's his wedding, Emily." "I know that," I said. "But I bought the house. I helped them start their life, and now I'm not even invited?" My mother sighed, the sound sharp with irritation. "We don't want to cause drama. Jason's under a lot of stress." I stared at her. "So am I." She finally looked up at me then, eyes tired. "This isn't about you." That sentence landed harder than anything Jason had said. "So you're okay with it?" I asked quietly. "You're okay with me not being there?" My father shrugged. "It's better this way." Better. The word tasted bitter. Better for who? I looked from one to the other, searching for something, guilt, hesitation, any sign that they understood what this meant. They had already gone back to eating. The conversation, to them, was over. Something in me went cold. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the floor. "I should go." "Drive safe," my dad said, without looking up. That was it. No apology, no reassurance, no acknowledgement of the sacrifice I'd made or the hurt I was carrying. I walked out of the house into the early evening, the sky streaked with fading orange and purple. I paused by my car and looked back at the dining room window. My parents were still seated at the table, still eating, still moving forward as if nothing had happened. That was the moment clarity settled in. This wasn't just Jason. It never had been. It was a family pattern I'd been trying to outgrow by myself. A system where my presence was optional, my generosity expected, and my pain inconvenient. And I realized something else, too. I wasn't angry anymore. I was done. The wedding weekend arrived faster than I expected. The city buzzed with activity, flowers being delivered, suit bags carried into hotels, out-of-town guests flooding restaurants. I stayed home. I didn't dress up. I didn't scroll through social media. I worked quietly, focused. On the morning of the wedding, I opened the folder on my desk labeled Property. Inside were documents I'd reviewed dozens of times but never fully considered using this way. The house, the deed, my name. Still there, clear and undeniable. I called my realtor. She didn't ask why. She just asked when. By 9 o'clock, I was standing in the empty living room of the house Jason and Tessa thought was theirs. Sunlight streamed through the windows, catching dust motes in the air. It was a beautiful place. Warm, full of promise. I walked through each room slowly, taking it in, not with regret, but with resolve. The realtor explained the process again. Professional and calm. Appraisal, offers, timeline, lock change. Everything clean, everything legal. I signed where she pointed, my hand steady. I felt no rush of adrenaline, no thrill, just a deep, settling sense of rightness, like aligning something that had been crooked for years. By the time I left, the locks were scheduled to be changed. The sale was in motion, and for the first time since that message had arrived, my chest felt light. I drove away without looking back. Later that evening, my phone buzzed. Jason's name lit up the screen. I didn't answer. A voicemail followed. Then another. I listened to neither. Whatever he had to say could wait. I had waited long enough. I spent that night alone, not in sadness, but in reflection. I thought about the girl I'd been at 12, standing in the kitchen with a glass of milk, learning where she ranked. I thought about the years of effort that followed, the quiet victories no one celebrated. I thought about how easily I'd been invited back into the family once I had something they wanted. And I thought about the line I had finally crossed. This wasn't revenge, not really. It was balance. It was me taking responsibility for my own boundaries in a way no one else ever had. I hadn't taken anything from them. I had simply stopped giving. When I went to bed that night, I slept deeply. No dreams, no rehearsed conversations, just rest. The next day, while Jason stood at an altar, surrounded by people who called themselves his closest family, he had no idea that his certainty was already unraveling, that the key he carried would soon be useless, that the assumption he'd made that I would always absorb the loss quietly had finally been wrong. I didn't know exactly how the confrontation would unfold. I didn't know what words I'd say when we faced each other again. All I knew was this: the door I'd closed wasn't meant to keep anyone out. It was meant to let me breathe. And once you choose yourself that clearly, there's no going back. The day Jason got married, the sky was almost offensively perfect. Clear, bright, the kind of blue that feels staged. I noticed that right away, how wrong it felt that the world could look so clean while something inside me had finally, completely hardened. I didn't get dressed up. I didn't stand in front of the mirror wondering if I should look softer or kinder or more forgiving. I pulled on jeans, a plain black shirt, tied my hair back, and grabbed my keys. No makeup, no jewelry. Just myself, exactly as I was. Somewhere across town, Jason was probably adjusting his tie, laughing with friends, stepping into a role he'd always assumed would be his center stage, supported, celebrated. And I was driving in the opposite direction, toward the house he believed was his. Technically, legally, quietly, it wasn't. By the time I arrived, the realtor was already there. Dana, sharp blazer, calm eyes, the kind of woman who didn't ask unnecessary questions. She handed me a folder as soon as I stepped onto the porch. "The appraisal came in yesterday," she said. "You'll still walk away comfortably." I nodded. I wasn't there for comfort. I flipped through the pages anyway, scanning the numbers, the terms, my name printed clearly where it mattered. Emily Carter, owner. The words grounded me more than any affirmation ever had. Inside, the house was empty. No boxes, no furniture, just echoes. Sunlight spilled across the hardwood floors, catching on dust in the air. I walked through each room slowly. The kitchen where Tessa had once talked about backsplash tiles. The living room where Jason said they'd host every holiday. The bedroom they'd already mentally claimed. I didn't feel sadness. I felt distance. Dana pointed to the signature line. "Right here." I signed. Once. Then again. My hand didn't shake. The locksmith arrived shortly after. An older man in a red flannel shirt. He worked efficiently, unscrewing the old deadbolt, fitting the new one in place. The sound of metal clicking into alignment felt final in a way words never could. "All set," he said, testing the lock. He handed me the old key. I looked at it for a second. The same key Jason carried in his pocket right now, thinking it opened something that no longer belonged to him. I slid it into an envelope marked "Return to previous owner." He wouldn't need it anymore. By the time I left, the house no longer felt like a gift I'd given away. It felt like something I'd reclaimed. I drove a few blocks away and parked. My car angled just far enough that I could see the front porch without being obvious. I didn't know why I stayed. Maybe part of me needed to witness the moment fully, to let it finish unfolding instead of imagining it later. It didn't take long. Around 7:15, headlights swept across the driveway. Laughter carried through the open air. Jason's voice came first, familiar and careless. "We're home." I watched as they stepped out of the car. Jason, still in his suit, Tessa beside him, heels in hand, smiling in that tired, happy way people do after a long day of being looked at. Jason walked up the porch steps and slid the key into the lock. Nothing happened. He frowned, tried again. The key scraped uselessly against metal. He jiggled it harder this time. "Hang on," he muttered. "That's weird." Tessa stepped closer. "Maybe it's stuck." He tried again. Then once more, force creeping into the motion. The handle rattled. The door didn't budge. "What the hell?" he said, louder now. I opened my car door and stepped out. The porch light flicked on as I walked closer, casting long shadows across the wood. Jason turned when he heard my footsteps. His face shifted in stages, confusion first, then surprise, then something like disbelief. "Emily?" he said. "What are you doing here?" I stopped a few feet away, close enough that he could see my expression clearly. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't smile. "I sold it," I said. The words hung there, simple and devastating. "What?" Jason laughed once, sharp and uncertain. "What are you talking about?" "I sold the house," I repeated. "This morning. Papers are signed. Locks are changed. New owners take possession next week." Tessa's smile vanished. She looked from Jason to me, her brows knitting together. "Jason, what does she mean?" Jason stepped forward, anger flashing across his face. "This isn't funny. You can't just sell our house." "It was never yours," I said calmly. "I paid for it. I owned it. I kept the deed in my name. That was temporary," he snapped. "You knew that." "Yes," I said. "I did." Tessa's voice was quiet now. "Jason, you told me she didn't want to come to the wedding." I didn't look at Jason when I answered. "I was told not to. Close family only. Remember?" The color drained from his face. Tessa turned to him slowly. "You said she chose not to come." Jason opened his mouth, then closed it. It wasn't like that." I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I didn't wave it around. I didn't shove it in anyone's face. I simply unlocked the screen and held it out. One message. One sentence. Time-stamped. Clear. Tessa read it. Once. Then again. "You lied to me," she said, her voice breaking in a way that wasn't loud but was unmistakable. "You lied about your own sister." Jason's frustration exploded. "You're overreacting. This is between us." "No," she said sharply. "This is about who you are." She looked back at me, eyes shining. "I didn't know. I swear, I didn't." I believed her. That surprised me. Behind us, a car pulled up fast. Then another. Doors slammed. My parents' voices cut through the air. "What is going on?" my father demanded, still in socks, his tie loosened. My mother rushed forward, taking in the scene: the locked door, Jason's face, my calm. "You did this on purpose," she said, accusation thick in her voice. "On his wedding day." "I did this after being told I wasn't family," I replied. Jason pointed at me, shaking. "You're punishing me." "No," I said. "I stopped protecting you from consequences." Tessa stepped forward, standing beside me instead of him. The movement was small, but it landed harder than any shout. "I'm with her," she said, "at least about the truth." Silence followed. Heavy, unavoidable. For the first time in my life, no one spoke over me. No one dismissed me. No one told me not to make a scene. I didn't stay to argue. I didn't wait for apologies that wouldn't come. I turned, walked back to my car, and got in. As I drove away, I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I didn't feel victorious. I felt finished. Finished shrinking. Finished explaining. Finished giving pieces of myself away and hoping they'd be treated with care. The door that had closed behind me wasn't slammed in anger. It was shut with intention. And for the first time, the silence that followed didn't feel empty. It felt like freedom. 2 weeks passed after that night, and the noise finally died down. Not because things were resolved, but because there was nothing left to argue about. Jason stopped calling. My parents didn't reach out at all. The silence that followed wasn't dramatic. It was hollow, like walking into a room after everyone's already left and realizing no one plans to come back. At first, I thought I'd feel relieved. I had drawn a line so clearly that no one could pretend it wasn't there anymore. I had chosen myself in a way I never had before. But clarity doesn't cancel grief. It just gives it a shape. I threw myself into work. Meetings filled my calendar. Reports piled up. Clients praised my focus. I smiled, nodded, delivered. On the outside, I looked composed, productive, untouched. Inside, I was still untangling years of wanting something. I'd never had a family that saw me without conditions. Then Tessa called. Her name on my screen surprised me more than it should have. I let it ring once, twice, before answering. "Emily," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "I hope this isn't inappropriate." "It's okay," I replied. And I meant it. We met at a small cafe near downtown, one of those places tucked between buildings that never seem to change. Mismatched chairs, soft lighting, the smell of cinnamon clinging to the air like a memory. Tessa arrived early, already seated, hands wrapped around a mug she hadn't touched. "I didn't know," she said, as soon as I sat down. "About the text. About any of it." "I believe you," I said. The words came easily. That surprised me too. She exhaled slowly, like she'd been holding something in for days. "I called off the honeymoon. I told him I needed space." I looked at her, searching for hesitation. I didn't find any. "He said you were dramatic," she continued, her jaw tightening, "that you'd always had issues with him. But I saw the message. I saw your face that night. That wasn't drama. That was clarity." We sat in silence for a moment, letting the truth settle between us. "I don't know what I'm going to do yet," she admitted, "but I know I can't ignore what I saw." I nodded. "You don't have to decide anything right now." She looked at me then, really looked. "I'm sorry," she said, "not just for him, for all of it." That apology mattered more than any I'd waited for before. At the next table, a woman with graying curls and a scar near her eye glanced up from her notebook. "I hope you don't mind me saying this," she said gently, but I recognized that tone, that conversation. Tessa smiled faintly. "Family?" The woman laughed softly. "The kind that invites you out of obligation and forgets you on purpose." We all shared a look of quiet understanding. No explanations needed. Her name was Miriam. She told us her sister had excluded her from a wedding years earlier. "Said it was easier that way," she added with a shrug. "Easier for who?" We stayed longer than planned. Talked about things that didn't need fixing work, books, the relief of being believed. When we finally stood to leave, something had shifted again. Not back toward pain. Forward. That afternoon, I drove past the house. It looked different now. Same structure, same porch. But the energy had changed. It wasn't waiting for anyone anymore. It was just there, solid, neutral, mine. I'd bought it back the week after the wedding. Quietly, cleanly. I didn't announce it. I didn't explain it to anyone. This time, the decision wasn't wrapped in hope or generosity. It was grounded. I repainted the walls myself. Warm colors. Not neutral, not safe. I filled the shelves with books I loved instead of decor meant to impress. I opened the curtains and let the light in without worrying who might see inside. A month later, I hosted my first dinner there. Not a big one, no speeches, just a long table, mismatched plates, candles flickering as the sun dipped low. Tessa came, so did Miriam. Dana, my realtor, showed up with pie and no questions. A few friends from work filled in the rest, people who had chosen me without needing proof. We ate slowly, laughed easily. The house hummed in a way it never had before. At one point, Tessa raised her glass. "To locked doors," she said. I smiled. And unlocked truths. The words felt earned. A year passed. Jason never apologized. My parents never acknowledged what they'd allowed. For a while, that used to ache. Now, it simply was. Some wounds don't close, they scar. And scars tell the truth better than denial ever could. What surprised me most was how little I missed the version of family I'd lost. Once the illusion was gone, there was nothing left to grieve. I hadn't been walking away from love. I'd been walking away from expectation. One evening, alone in the living room, I lit a cinnamon candle and sat on the floor with my back against the couch. The house was quiet, but not empty. I thought about the girl I'd been 12 years old, holding a glass of milk, learning she ranked second without anyone saying it out loud. I wish I could tell her everything worked out neatly, that people changed, that fairness arrived on time. But that wouldn't be true. What I would tell her is this: you don't need to earn your place by giving everything away. You don't need to buy love with sacrifice. And you don't have to stay where your presence is tolerated instead of welcomed. Some families are born, others are chosen, and sometimes the bravest thing you can do is lock the door not to punish anyone on the outside, but to finally protect what's inside. When I went to bed that night, I didn't replay conversations. I didn't wonder what I could have said differently. I slept deeply, in a house that held me without conditions. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was surviving. I felt like I was home. Some stories don't end with an apology. They end with clarity. This wasn't a story about money or a house worth $770,000. It was about what happens when someone spends a lifetime trying to earn a place that should never have been conditional. It was about being the quiet one, the dependable one, the one who gives and gives until the giving becomes expected and the person disappears behind it. What I learned is simple, but not easy. Love that requires you to erase yourself is not love. And boundaries are not punishments. They are doors we close so we can finally breathe. If you saw yourself anywhere in this story, at the table where you were overlooked, in the silence after you spoke up, in the moment you realized you were valued more for what you provided than for who you were, then this space is for you too. On Revenge Tale Society, we don't tell stories to glorify revenge. We tell them to uncover truth, to name quiet betrayals, and to remind each other that choosing yourself is not selfish, it's survival. If you believe in stories that heal instead of hide, stories that sit with discomfort and still move forward, consider subscribing to the channel. Stay with us. Share your voice in the comments, because sometimes the family that truly sees you is still waiting to be found.